For decades, media has framed juvenile delinquency as a growing epidemic in the United States. In the late 1990s, 1/3 of total news time was dedicated to televised coverage of crime stories, even though crime rates during that time remained fairly constant. 2/3 of violent crime reported on the news featured juvenile offenders, while statistics reveal only 15% of crimes involving violence were committed by youth. 40% of the stories reported in newspapers about children are related to violence, while only 25% are related to education. Of the violent crimes highlighted in the media, homicides are disproportionately reported, and media portrayal of juvenile offenders are dominated by Black and Latino youth. Distorted media accounts and portrayals has had a huge impact on the public perception of the prevalence of youth crime and the image of the juvenile offender, as well as serious implications on policies that shape how these institutions discipline our youth. Many may not know this, but the zero-tolerance rhetoric commonly used in school discipline discourse was adopted verbatim from a U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration manual. The fact is, as the government launched this nationwide effort to get tough on crime, schools began viewing their youth as perpetrators rather than struggling people with the potential needing our guidance. Since its inception in the 1880s, the juvenile justice system has seen a major shift from its original emphasis on rehabilitation, diversion, and protection for juveniles to a harsh, punitive model of justice focused on holding juveniles accountable for their crimes through an increased use of both waivers to criminal courts and determinate sentencing. King County has one of the lowest youth detention rates of any urban county in the United States. The county's juvenile detention population has declined almost 70% since the 1990s. This should be reason for celebration. However, while the overall detention rate has declined, the proportion of youth of color in detention has grown significantly, particularly for Black youth. Approximately 10% of the county's total youth population is comprised of Black youth. Yet, they make up almost 50% of the detention population. With 25% being Latino, Asian, and Native American, approximately 75% of the entire youth detention population are youth of color. This is problematic, especially when 7 out of every 10 cases involving Caucasian girls are dismissed, while only 3 out of every 10 cases involving African American girls are dismissed. According to their website, the King County claims to be committed to being the first urban county in the nation to decrease its detention population, while also reducing the racial disproportionalities within it through investments in alternatives to detention, racial equity, and juvenile justice reform. Yet, as recent news sources indicate, King County has moved to build a new courthouse and youth jail. In 2012, voters approved a ballot measure for $210 million to fund capital costs to replace the Children and Family Justice Center, even though violent crime had been at its lowest since 1970. According to a Seattle Youth Violence Prevention Initiative assessment conducted in December 2015, only 16% of crimes were considered violent, with the vast majority being simple assaults. Studies show that incarceration of non-violent juvenile offenders actually exacerbates the problem as opposed to alleviating it. Brown University and MIT conducted another study of 35,000 public school students and found that juvenile offenders who are incarcerated are 67% more likely to be in jail again by the age of 25 than juvenile offenders who are not. If incarceration of youth leads to their future incarceration as adults, why would we consider allocating funds for more incarceration facilities? In looking closer, apparently only 1/4 of the funding will go towards the detention facility itself. The remaining funds will go towards building new courtrooms, meeting rooms, and offices for probation staff, lawyers, and judges. What does this reveal about our priorities? Are we really prioritizing youth and their rehabilitation, or are we further benefiting those who are in positions of power to make life-altering decisions for our youth? Needless to say, construction of this new Children and Family Justice Center has been highly controversial. Those in favor argue for the necessity of such a facility to replace the current outmoded and dilapidated Juvenile Justice Center. Executive Constantine argues that the center is necessary to bring together services and programs to help kids turn their lives around. Many have spoken up in opposition, arguing that an investment in such a facility equates to an investment in youth incarceration. During a speech in support of the No New Youth Jail movement, Dr. Angela Davis stated, "If one looks at the history of jails and prisons in this country, almost any time you build a prison, it will be filled." Local activists Ghazi Ross and Nikita Oliver allude to the long-term effects of youth incarceration in writing, "Building a new youth jail and filling it with nonviolent juvenile offenders and youth who violate probation will only accomplish one thing: creating more violent adult offenders for the Seattle-King County region." To be frank, a youth jail is a public safety nightmare. It is the jail, not the youth held in the jail, that poses the greatest threat to public safety in Seattle and King County. In hopes of appeasing those in opposition, officials reduced the center's bed count from the current 212 detention beds to a total of 112 detention beds, emphasizing the facility's capability to convert unneeded beds into other usable program space. However, no new youth jail advocates do not seem satisfied. If a new youth jail is not the answer, what is? To answer this, we must first take note of the history of the juvenile justice system. The creation of a juvenile justice system that functions separately from the adult criminal justice system was predicated on the fact that delinquent youth lacked the maturity and capability for ill intent in committing their crimes and were more easily rehabilitated than adults. As such, the juvenile justice system emphasized rehabilitation, diversion, and protection for those youth. Since then, we have migrated to a much harsher, punitive model of justice that processes juvenile offenders as if they were adults, holding them entirely accountable for their actions. In essence, tougher laws were created, which brought an influx of offenders that overwhelmed the current juvenile justice infrastructure, resulting in delayed case processing and overcrowding, which in turn necessitated increased government funding for juvenile facilities. This is the reason we have counties like ours allocating funds for youth detention facilities as opposed to community-based prevention and interventions for youth, particularly youth of color. Abolition of our juvenile justice system would result in the neglect of our victims and communities' concern for public safety, but if we are not careful, perpetuation and expansion of the system may result in the elimination of any hope of rehabilitation for the offender and a repetition of the cycle previously mentioned. So where do we go from here? The balanced and restorative justice model has emerged as an alternative philosophy and balanced approach to supporting a community's need to sanction crime, rehabilitate offenders, and ensure public safety. The model has three components: accountability, competency development, and community safety. The Barge model suggests each of the following. Number 1, crime is most effectively sanctioned when offenders take personal responsibility for their crimes and make amends. Number 2, successful rehabilitation of offenders requires the acquisition of certain educational, vocational, social, and civil competencies. And number 3, public safety cannot be guaranteed with confinement of offenders, but must involve collaborative, community-based prevention efforts. Restorative justice concepts are based on indigenous approaches, focused on healing harm rather than continuing a cycle of crime and punishment. This demands a shift from labeling people as offenders and victims to looking for who was harmed, which could extend to anyone involved, including the offender. While there are many models of restorative justice practices, they all begin with building community, so that when a problem arises, everyone in the community actively participates in the process of finding a solution. One such practice is restorative justice or peacemaking circles. In this practice, the young offender sits in a circle with his parents, other students, teachers, counselors, and principal prior to re-entry into the community. Each of the members in the circle are essential in providing him the support he needs to re-enter his normal life. This approach focuses on building relationships marked by understanding and trust before creating a concrete plan and reaching a consensus decision on next steps. I had the opportunity to attend a 2-day peacemaking circle for racism and oppression with several strangers in and beyond Seattle. It was a truly remarkable experience. Many of us entered the peacemaking circle with reservations about the process of being vulnerable and transparent with complete strangers in order to build trust and understanding. But we quickly found liberation in the process and witnessed the power of sharing story and building community. We had conversations about white supremacy, oppression, and internalized racism to depths that I never thought was possible with anyone, much less strangers. The 2-day experience challenged my own biases towards others, reminded me of the humanity I share with all people, and thus expanded my ability to empathize with others' experiences. Over the course of 2 days, I feel the people in that room have a better understanding of me than some of my closest friends. I cannot imagine the profound impact a peacemaking circle would have on the rehabilitation and re-entry of a juvenile offender. As we continue to reform our juvenile justice system for the sake of the victims, community, and offenders, may we not only treat the symptoms, but diagnose and address the underlying problem by implementing new, creative, and collaborative community-based prevention methods like this one.